It was a warm summer evening in the Hollywood Hills, where moonlight bathed the sharp lines of Keanu Reeves's modest but elegant home. The scent of jasmine drifted through the open patio doors, mingling with the quiet hum of conversation and the clinking of wine glasses. This wasn't one of those wild celebrity parties splashed across tabloids. No paparazzi, no influencers live streaming their outfits. Just a few close friends, colleagues, and neighbors. Invited because Keanu trusted them, and yet someone didn't belong. Near the marble-topped outdoor bar, laughter pierced the calm. Not the kind born from joy, but from ridicule. The kind that makes a room fall awkwardly silent a moment too late. A sharply dressed man in a tailored white blazer stood towering over an older woman in a simple gray uniform. Her eyes were downcast. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to clear a glass that had shattered on the tile floor. The man chuckled, waving dramatically toward her with the same hand that moments earlier had accidentally knocked the glass from the table. "Jackson, you know, in my house we hire staff who don't drop things." "Just saying." "What are you, nervous? It's not like the Queen's here." "Oh wait, maybe in your world this is royalty." A few guests chuckled uneasily. One or two turned away, pretending they hadn't heard. The woman, Maria, whispered an apology in broken English, still reaching for the shards. Jackson smirked and sipped from his wine. "Jackson, honestly, Keanu's too soft. I'd fire someone for less." What he didn't notice was the man standing quietly behind him. Keanu had been watching, silent, still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes locked on the scene with unwavering intensity. And in that moment, everything changed. The clinking of crystal glasses resumed in the background, but the energy had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The tension hung in the air like a static charge. Keanu didn't say a word. He simply crouched down beside Maria, gently taking the dustpan from her hand. His presence startled her. She looked up, eyes wide, shaking her head. "Mariano, no, sir. I clean. Please, I clean." But Keanu gave her a soft, reassuring nod and began picking up the glass himself, piece by careful piece. His fingers moved methodically, tenderly, as though honoring her dignity one shard at a time. And that's when Jackson turned around. "Jackson, whoa. Whoa, what are you doing? Keanu, seriously? You're cleaning up after the help now?" The laughter that followed wasn't communal. It was solitary, his own. Loud, grating, the kind of laugh meant to dominate a room. "Jackson, this is why you artists never last in real business. You think humility is a virtue. In my world, that's just weakness." Keanu stood slowly, his eyes meeting Jackson's without a single word. But that silence, the way Keanu held it, spoke volumes. It was the kind of silence that made people uncomfortable, the kind that made them examine themselves without knowing why. Still, Jackson wasn't done. "Jackson, you invite me to your party, serve me this Costco tier wine, and I have to deal with your clumsy little cleaning crew. No offense, but your standards are slipping." Maria turned away, face flushed with shame. She began gathering her things, mumbling something about needing to check the back kitchen. One of the guests near the fire pit looked at Jackson, then at Keanu, clearly uneasy now. But again, Keanu said nothing. He turned back toward the kitchen, entrance where Maria had disappeared, quiet, thoughtful. Jackson scoffed and muttered under his breath. "Jackson man's got millions and still runs a charity for incompetence." What he didn't see was the slight movement near the hallway. Keanu's personal assistant, Lily, discreetly tapping a button on her phone. She was recording, and Jackson had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Jackson wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone like Keanu Reeves. And that silence, the quiet defiance, gnawed at him. He took another long sip from his wine, his ego bruised just enough to make him dangerous. Jackson, you know, I expected more. Keanu Reeves, the stoic legend. I figured you'd at least know how to manage a house staff. Instead, you've got that woman. What's her name again? Maria, acting like this is some back-alley diner in Tijuana. Several heads turned. Even the ones who had laughed earlier stiffened. But Jackson didn't care. In fact, their discomfort seemed to fuel him. He walked toward the kitchen entrance, glass in hand, speaking louder now, loud enough for Maria to hear. Jackson, you drop one glass, okay? But two? That's a pattern. I've fired people for less than that. And I pay a hell of a lot more than whatever you're making here. From behind a small partition wall, Maria froze. She clutched a towel, her knuckles white. In the far corner of the room, Lily's phone stayed recording, tucked subtly between a stack of menus on the bar. Her expression hadn't changed. She knew better than to intervene yet. Keanu hadn't given the signal. Jackson, however, was on a roll. Jackson, what is this? A rescue shelter for underqualified workers. You should see the way she was looking at me earlier, like I wasn't supposed to say anything, like I was the bad guy. He turned back to the room, grinning as if waiting for applause. Instead, silence. Even the background music seemed to lower itself, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Jackson shrugged, as if annoyed at their lack of appreciation. Jackson, you can be rich and still be classless. Guess that's what happens when you play dress-up for a living instead of building real companies. Keanu, who had been standing by the window, turned slowly. He walked toward the center of the room, not with anger, not with speed, just calm, unwavering purpose. He still hadn't spoken a word, but every pair of eyes now followed him. The air felt different. And Jackson? He was too arrogant to notice the storm he had just summoned. Keanu stopped a few feet from Jackson. The guests shifted nervously, unsure of what was about to unfold. His gaze was steady, no fury, no theatrics. Just a deep, haunting quiet. But Jackson, ever drunk on his own sense of superiority, took Keanu's silence as weakness. Jackson, oh, come on, Keanu. Don't look at me like that. You invited me here. What? I'm not allowed to have an opinion about how your place is run, he scoffed, and tossed his now empty wine glass onto a nearby tray, the sound ringing out like a bell of mockery. Jackson, besides, let's be real. You're not exactly known for your standards. Everyone in this town knows you're the nice guy, the charity case. You let fans sleep in your trailers, ride subways like you're broke, tip waiters like you're trying to impress karma. Instead of investors, a few guests laughed, awkwardly, but still, the kind of laugh that betrays an inner discomfort, but also a cowardly instinct to side with power. Keanu didn't flinch. He glanced briefly toward the hallway where Maria had gone. His eyes lingered for a beat too long, and that's when Jackson struck again. Jackson, let's be honest. You've got more in common with your maid than you do with us, he smirked as if delivering a punchline. Jackson, hell, if you ever go broke, you might be scrubbing floors right next to her. This time the laughter was louder, not from everyone, but enough to sting. One of the producers from Keanu's last film whispered to someone and took a sip of his drink, turning away. A pair of actresses near the fire pit avoided eye contact. The social cowardice rippled outward, like a silent betrayal. Keanu stood in the center of it all, surrounded by people, and yet completely alone. A man of grace, dignity, and global respect, reduced for a moment to a punchline at his own party. But Keanu didn't move, didn't respond. He simply looked at Jackson, and for the first time, Jackson blinked. The room, still tinged with awkward laughter, felt suddenly smaller. Keanu remained unmoved. His silence held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The same stillness that had once captivated millions on screen now hung in the air like a living thing, pulsating with a quiet energy that few could comprehend. And then, It happened. One of the guests, an older woman with glasses perched atop her nose, caught a glimpse of Keanu's face. Her eyes widened. "Guest," whispers to another. "Isn't that—" The words trailed off. She wasn't the only one who had begun to suspect. Keanu had lived too many years in the public eye to be just another guy in the room for long. His calm demeanor, his profound restraint, the way people had always gravitated toward him, it was all starting to click for those who had just now put the pieces together. But Jackson? He still didn't get it. He waved off the whisper, smiling smugly as if to dismiss the unease in the room. Jackson, raising his glass. "Look, if you can't handle a little joke, then maybe you should have stayed home. We all have our roles to play, right? Some of us get to be heroes, and some of us get to clean up after them." Louder chuckles erupted from a few more corners of the room, but the moment had changed. Keanu's steady presence hadn't broken. His silence was now a defiance, a quiet challenge to the chaos swirling around him. And then, just as Jackson went to take another triumphant sip from his glass, Keanu moved. With the same unhurried grace, he slid the chair back from the table where Jackson had been sitting, its legs scraping against the floor with an almost imperceptible shriek. But the sound was enough. For the first time, Jackson paused. The room shifted. A man nearby, a fellow actor who had worked with Keanu on several films, caught his breath. His eyes flicked back and forth between Keanu and Jackson, something dawning. "On him, actor," quietly to another guest. "Wait, you don't recognize him?" Suddenly, the noise around them felt distant. The tension thickened, almost suffocating. The truth was now surfacing like a slow tide, and Jackson's arrogance was no longer enough to keep the floodwaters back. The truth was undeniable now. Keanu Reeves, the man they had all been laughing at, wasn't just the humble star everyone pretended to admire. He was Keanu Reeves. And he had heard everything. The moment was electric. Every eye in the room was on Keanu now, as if the entire evening had hinged on this single moment of revelation. His gaze was still fixed on Jackson, but now there was an undeniable weight to it, something that made the air around them feel thicker, heavier. Jackson, once so confident, so untouchable, shifted uneasily. His smile had faded, replaced by a nervous edge. Jackson, awkwardly. "Look, I didn't mean, hey, I'm just, trying to keep things light." Keanu didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was becoming louder than Jackson's words. Keanu took a slow step toward the bar, as though deciding which drink to pour. His movements were deliberate, measured. He reached for a bottle of scotch, one that had been sitting untouched at the far end of the counter, and poured a single, deliberate glass. Jackson, stammering, Are you really just going to—" But Keanu didn't acknowledge him. He took the glass in hand, turning back to the room with the same quiet dignity he had always carried. It wasn't a show. It wasn't a performance. It was just Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves, calmly. This party was meant to be a celebration, for friends, for people who share respect. For those who understand what it means to treat others with dignity. His voice was soft, almost inaudible to those who weren't paying attention, but the words sliced through the tension like a hot knife through butter. Keanu Reeves, turning to Jackson. But respect isn't something you can demand. It's earned. Jackson stood there stuttering, unsure of how to respond. The room had gone completely still, and now it was his turn to feel the sting of eyes upon him. Every guest was watching, waiting, as the power slowly shifted from Jackson to Keanu. Jackson, trying to recover. I mean, come on, that's just how people are, right? I wasn't serious. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to be loud or brash. Keanu Reeves, slowly. "No, Jackson, you weren't serious." Pause. "But now everyone here knows exactly who you are." The weight of those words hung in the air. Jackson's face drained of color. He stammered, but nothing came out. His smirk, his arrogance, had evaporated. Around them, the other guests began to murmur, exchanging uneasy glances. The realization had dawned. They had been complicit in a moment of cruelty, and now they were caught in the wake of Keanu's quiet power. Keanu turned his attention back to Maria, who had appeared at the edge of the kitchen doorway, watching, in stunned silence. He nodded at her, small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The power had shifted, and Jackson was standing at the center of a storm he had no idea how to weather. The room was suffocating with tension. Jackson, once the loudest voice, was now small in the center of the room. His usual bravado had been stripped away, replaced with an uncomfortable unease that no glass of wine could fix. Keanu hadn't moved from his place at the bar. He stood still, calm and collected, his posture a silent challenge. There was no need for loud words or gestures. No, he had already made his point, but Jackson, too proud, too blinded by his ego, wasn't ready to admit defeat. Jackson, gritting his teeth. "What's the deal, huh? You think you're better than me because you've played a few characters in movies? That's what this is about? You want to lecture me?" The words came out harsher now, as though his own insecurities were bubbling up, desperate to find an outlet. He stepped closer to Keanu, as if daring him to react. "Jackson," snapping, "you think you can just walk in here and change everything? You've got nothing to say, nothing real to offer. You're just a nice guy with a lot of free time and money." Keanu's eyes never left Jackson, but his expression didn't shift. His face was an impenetrable mask. He didn't need to speak. Louder, didn't need to get angry. His presence alone was commanding enough to freeze the room. Keanu Reeves, quietly. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to scream. It simply is. Jackson laughed, but it was hollow, an act, more than anything. He had reached the point where his words couldn't save him. The power he once had, the control he held in this space, was slipping away. And deep down, he knew it. Jackson, mocking. "Oh, I get it. You're the wise one, huh? The sage? Going to impart your little pearls of wisdom now?" Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't even react to the mockery. Instead, he turned to the other guests, who had been standing in the background, whispering among themselves. He wasn't looking for their validation, but in that moment, they all knew the truth. Keanu was in control now. He slowly set his glass down on the bar and took a deliberate step forward. Keanu Reeves, calmly. "This isn't about wisdom, Jackson. This is about character, and you've shown us exactly who you are." Jackson's mouth went dry. He was losing his grip. For the first time, he looked around the room, his face faltering as the eyes of the guests turned away from him, no longer amused or entertained. Some had already started pulling their phones out, not to record the chaos, but to document the moment they realized Jackson wasn't invincible. Keanu wasn't done, but he didn't need to say more. The damage was done. Jackson's power had evaporated in the span of seconds. The confrontation wasn't over yet, but the tone had shifted, and everyone knew it. The room was silent now. No one dared to speak. The tension was palpable, thick in the air like smoke, but there was a clarity to it. The truth had been laid bare, and the facade Jackson had so carefully constructed was crumbling in front of him. Keanu stood firm, his eyes unwavering. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. His presence, his dignity, and the truth, in his words, had done the work for him. And now, Jackson was the one standing under the harsh light, exposed. Jackson shifted uncomfortably, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for another glass of wine, his last attempt to regain his composure. But the glass felt foreign in his hand, as though it no longer belonged to him. Jackson, faltering. Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I was just having fun. His voice wavered now, an edge of panic creeping in. He looked around the room, but no one was laughing anymore. No one was on his side. They were all staring at him, some with disappointment, others with clear disdain. A few guests exchanged glances. A couple of them shifted uncomfortably, muttering under their breath. The tide had turned. Jackson was no longer the center of attention, but the object of sympathy, for all the wrong reasons. One of the women who had been laughing earlier, the one who had whispered to her friend about Keanu's identity, finally spoke up. Her voice was steady, but it carried a weight that Jackson couldn't escape. Guest, softly. It's not about having fun, Jackson. It's about respect. And you lost that the moment you decided to put someone else down to make yourself feel better. The words hung in the air like a judgment. And then, in a quiet but unmistakable gesture, the group of guests began to turn away. Jackson's face reddened. The laughter that had once surrounded him now felt distant, foreign. The truth had spread through the room like wildfire, and there was no running from it now. Keanu, still standing at the center, never wavered. He simply watched, a silent observer of the unraveling that was happening before him. His influence wasn't in the words he spoke. It was in the dignity he carried, the way he conducted himself. It was his quiet strength that had flipped the entire narrative. And as the last of the guests started to drift away, avoiding eye contact with Jackson, it was clear. The social currency he'd built on arrogance and mockery was worthless now. Keanu's eyes met Jackson's one last time. No anger, no spite, just a calm acknowledgement of the reality that had just unfolded. Keanu Reeves, softly. You've lost their respect, Jackson. That's the only thing that matters. With that, Keanu turned and walked away, his movements as measured and graceful as always. The justice wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was just real. The guests, left to process what had just occurred, began to whisper, but this time it was different. They weren't talking about the spectacle, they were talking about what they had just witnessed. The balance had shifted, and Jackson was left to face the consequences of his own arrogance. And as Keanu disappeared into the hallway, his quiet victory resonated in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. They knew the truth, and they would never forget it. Keanu's departure was as quiet as his presence had been throughout the evening, subtle, dignified, and above all, unbothered by the chaos left in his wake. He left the room with a graceful calmness, not needing applause or acknowledgement. The guests who had once hovered around him with curiosity now watched his retreating back, some with admiration, others with regret. Jackson, meanwhile, stood frozen, the heavy weight of his actions hanging on his shoulders like a cloak of shame. The glances that once reverberated with praise now filled him with scorn. The power he had abused was slipping through his fingers, leaving only the bitter taste of regret. The air in the room had changed. The once vibrant conversations now faltered as guests murmured in hushed tones. One by one, they began to leave, a few lingering to share uncomfortable farewells with Jackson, their voices stiff, polite, but with a clear air of detachment. The charm and charisma he once wielded like a weapon had been obliterated. In the distance, Keanu's sleek car awaited, its driver standing still, observing the scene with silent understanding. Keanu, ever the quiet force, had already left behind his message. He didn't need to witness the fallout. It was enough that his actions had made the truth undeniable, and Jackson was now a man alone. Back in the house, Jackson's phone buzzed. Again, this time a message from a higher-up at his firm. Text message: "We've had complaints. You're suspended effective immediately. We'll discuss your future when things settle down." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The public humiliation was one thing, But this was something entirely different. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built on power and intimidation was crumbling in front of him. A few guests, unable to hide their pity any longer, turned to leave, casting one last glance at Jackson. His demeanor, once so commanding, was now defeated. The house that had been filled with laughter only hours ago was now quiet. The guests who had once flattered him had scattered, leaving behind the hollow sound of footsteps echoing through the empty space. And as the door clicked shut behind the last of the departing guests, Jackson stood alone in the room, the weight of his actions suffocating him. He had thought himself untouchable, but now he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own failure. In the distance, the last glimpse of Keanu's car disappeared around the corner, as if marking the final shift in the evening's power dynamics. Keanu had walked away, untouched, graceful in his silence. Jackson had been left to face the consequences of his cruelty, alone with his regret, and in that silence, the truth was undeniable. Keanu's quiet strength had won the day. The evening had come to an end. The house was still now, the sounds of footsteps and chatter replaced by the hum of distant city life outside. Keanu had already gone, as quietly as he had arrived, leaving a trail of reflection in his wake. Outside, the stars sparkled overhead as his car rolled down the empty street, the glow of the headlights casting fleeting shadows on the pavement. Keanu leaned back, his eyes calm, thoughtful, but content. There was no need for victory speeches or gestures of triumph. He knew deep down that the true victory lay not in winning the crowd's approval, but in doing what was right, even when it was the hardest thing to do. In the silence of his solitude, Keanu allowed himself a moment of peace. He had seen the injustice, heard the cruelty, and had simply chosen to act, not with anger but with dignity and grace. It was his way of life, a quiet rebellion against the noise of the world. The lesson, for those who were willing to see it, was simple. Power, wealth, and status were fleeting. What mattered was how one treated others, especially those who had no power, those who could not defend themselves. Keanu had not sought to make a spectacle of Jackson's fall. He didn't need to. The truth had been loud enough. Back at the house, the guests who had remained were left in the quiet aftermath, each reflecting on what had just transpired. The weight of Jackson's actions was now clear, and the sense of discomfort that lingered in the air was a testament to the truth that had been revealed. Maria, the housekeeper, stood quietly by the window in the quiet of her own space. Her heart felt lighter now. Keanu had restored more than her dignity. He had reminded her of her worth. He had shown her, and everyone in that room, that true strength lies not in cruelty or wealth, but in kindness, humility, and respect. As the final remnants of the evening faded, the words Keanu had spoken echoed in the minds of those who had been there. Keanu Reeves, softly to himself. Respect is the true currency we all hold, and it's the one thing we can give freely. For Keanu, there was no need for further words. The truth had been spoken, the lesson learned. And in the quiet aftermath of the evening, as the city hummed and the world moved on, it was clear. Justice, in its purest form, had been served. And so, Keanu walked through the world with his head held high, knowing that the true measure of a person was not what they had, but how they treated those who had nothing. The world was watching, and Keanu had just shown them the way. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this powerful story of justice, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible moments. Your support means the world to us, and we're bringing you even more stories that will inspire and leave you speechless. Hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest videos.